Well, kia ora koutou, comrades. Welcome to the session, Holding the Line Against Neoliberalism. I'm hoping that you have all found yourself to the right place. This evening, we're having a wonderful session discussing, debating the very real and enduring battle that we have against neoliberalism. My name is Julie Douglas. I'm a Pākehā New Zealander of Croatian and Scottish descent, and I've got the privilege this evening of chairing this session that I'm hoping that you all participate in and enjoy. Okay, to remind you that we'll be using the Q&A function, which you'll find access to along the bottom of your screen. If you wish to put questions in there, they'll be put to the two speakers this evening. After they've spoken, they'll be able to respond to those. We've got a moderator on hand if we need some help with that, so please engage with the opportunity. So I would like to present our two speakers this evening. The first speaker this evening is Jane Kelsey, Emeritus Professor at the University of Auckland. My still favourite book is The New Zealand Experiment, Jane, I must say, from 1995. It's a well-thumbed copy. But Jane is well known as an academic activist, a critic and outspoken person around WTO, IMF, the corporate-led globalisation that is afflicting us currently. In 2020, Jane was also the winner of the global category of the New Zealand Woman of Influence Awards. And following from Jane will be Annette Sykes. Welcome, Annette. Of Ngāti Pīkeo and Ngāti Mākeno descent and also British descent. Annette, of course, is a well-known human rights activist, lawyer specialising in the rights of Indigenous peoples, and is a very strong advocate for Māori independence and a nuclear-free, genetic-free, independent Pacific. Annette has been long involved in politics as well, and comes to us off a busy day in the tribunal. So we appreciate your time here this evening. Thank you. So it is a great honour to have these two great intellects, these wahine toa, with us here this evening. So I will leave you in their capable hands. Jane, over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this challenging event where we are facing a world that many of us had hoped would not come back and confront us again. I'm Pākehā. I'm a kind of itinerant. My mum was from Pātea, my father was from the Hokianga, and I've spent most of my time as an academic trying to do a bit of bridging between the academic world and the worlds of social justice and decolonisation. So I need to start with an apology that I've been away. I've just got back, and so I'm kind of parachuting into this session. But I do understand that we have already had some discussion around the kind of assault that the neoliberal agenda is making now on fundamental values of tikanga and social justice, as well as challenges that we need to develop strategies to educate, to reflect, to organise and to act. So I'd like to pick up on some of those. I hope I'm not going to be too academic, but I am going to come up with some practical suggestions based on things that we did last time. We had the really serious neoliberal assault in Aotearoa, which is the book that Julie was referring to, which was the first one I wrote on that, The New Zealand Experiment. What's really struck me as we've had this rapid ascent in the last couple of years of those that we would call both neoliberals and libertarians is the kind of values, perverse values, that stand out and that we're seeing now at the forefront of the current government. that has at its core individualism, that individuals stand devoid of any sense of community and any sense of social responsibilities, that there is a primacy of wealth and private property, and that those who have those need to be rewarded, and those who don't have them are blamed for their own inadequacies. If those with wealth want to share it and give it, that's what charity is about, but there is no redistribution. And of course, all of that is built on a denial of colonization and of its legacy. And these are the fundamental pillars of neoliberalism. But we need to be clear that when we talk about neoliberalism, we're actually talking about an ideology. The ideology of neoliberalism, or those perverse values and all of the policies and justifications that surround them, exist to sustain and advance a particularly pure and exploitive form of capitalism. Neoliberalism is the rationale, justification, ideological tool for that very pure and exploitive form of capitalism. And there was a great recent book published by a young intellectual, Catherine Coman, called The Financial Colonization of Aotearoa. And I want to highlight that a bit, because what it did for me was it headlined the central role that financial speculators and financial capital and assets played in the colonization of Aotearoa, because they bought, sold, traded, make money out of a whole lot of fictions, such as rights to land, that the state then supported them in. And if we see parallels and continuities between England's colonization of Aotearoa in the 19th century and the contemporary colonization under global capitalism, we see what I wrote about in my more recent book called The Fire Economy, where money and wealth is made out of finance, insurance, and real estate, and especially real estate. And the contemporary governments are about supporting that. And we know how the unregulated speculators in that finance world, here and overseas, have caused a succession of crises and meltdowns in recent decades. And we know that the human cost of those has fallen disproportionately on peoples who are already burdened with the legacy of colonization in the global south and in the global north, including Māori in Aotearoa. And we've seen in the past, and then in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s in Aotearoa, the interdependency of the state and those who have exploited that form of capitalism. And they have done so justifying according to those perverse values, and they have harnessed the state as the vehicle through which they have achieved that. So we have this continuity right through the eras of colonization, where Māori have resisted to those different forms, reasserting rangatiratanga, whether it was military rebellion or the establishment of alternatives, such as their own financial structures, their own ways of establishing institutions that reflect fundamental Māori values. The colonial state's response to that has been not so much through physical repression. Yes, there were wars, but it lost many of those wars, but by forcing Māori into that regime of land, wage labour, debt, and tax. And those were the instruments of dispossession, helped, of course, by legislation and by the courts and colonial law. And that was accompanied by a strategy of divide and rule that was an innate feature of global governance. When we see exactly that happening today, we see that unholy alliance where, contrary to Act's great claims of the withering of the state, they're harnessing the state to serve those interests and using the ideology that sustains them. And their goal is to embed that ideology of neoliberalism, the supremacy of this particularly brutal form of capitalism, so deeply in the state that it cannot be diluted, let alone transformed, as Te Tiriti o Waitangi requires. So that's the kind of intellectual space in which I want us to think about neoliberalism and what's happening with the neoliberal revival. Now, let me become a bit less academic. Roger Douglas, who of course was the vanguard of the last neoliberal experiment in the 80s and 90s, he wrote a book called Unfinished Business. And one of the things he said in that book, he had a chapter in the book about how to do this kind of revolution of the neoliberal kind. And one of the things he pointed out was the importance of making sure the opposition is finding it hard to shoot at moving targets. If you make radical change as rapidly as possible on as many fronts as possible, your critics are fighting last month's battles while the next phase is rolling out. So when we look at this 100-day strategy, it wasn't just a PR stunt. What it's done is having the critics and the victims of those policies fighting fires in a whole lot of fragmented ways, focusing on the symptoms of what the underlying transformative goal of neoliberalism is, while the more boring and less visible systemic changes that they really want are set in place. So in that last book I wrote, The Fire Economy, my key theme was that the architects of the 1984 to 1996 period was about system change. What they wanted to do was to make the state in its fundamental structures serve their objectives. And we focused at the time on many of the immediate impacts: benefit cuts, privatizations, labor market deregulation, etc., while they focused on sustaining and embedding that most radical form of financial capitalism, in particular, rights in the finance sector and the property ownership sector. So it's no accident that we have this crisis in the housing sector today, because that was fundamental about how you created and sustained wealth. Most of that became normalized under the Clark Labor government and Key's national government, with a few of the rough edges shaved off. So what we see now is a repeat of this. Right? The current politicians are reversing many of the hard-won gains that have clawed back some space within their neoliberal financialized state, partly for political self-interest, and in the case of ACT, for ideological reasons and to support their sponsors. So the attacks on Te Reo Māori, the attacks on Māori departments within the state, the smoke-free policies, the school lunches, etc. All of these are sites that have been fought over and have to be fought over, but they're incremental within that neoliberal state. And their reversal confirms what we've all known, that the state is not and has not been a beneficent post-colonial entity in creating those kinds of policies, those kinds of opportunities, those kinds of spaces. they have been largely sustaining still what had been established under colonisation and what's been established especially post-84. And I remember really well when as part of an entity, Kia Mohi o Kia Marama Trust, that I was working with in the 1980s, the Longi government came out with this push for devolution from the state to Māori entities to run various activities, all on a contractual basis where the state still held the purse strings and determined the terms of the contracts. And I remember David Longi saying, no, this is not about giving power to Māori, it's giving no more power to iwi than to the local Rotary Club. And the ease with which that was given is now being taken away by the same residual forces of state power. At the same time, treaty settlements were designed to create strong Māori capitalist allies. They insisted that there were these corporate structures. They made Māori buy back assets, defending strong Western-style property rights and profits. The Fisheries Treaty Settlement, the Sealord deal, vested Māori private property rights in fish in the Māori entities. So Shane Jones today, as the Minister for Fish, can claim to be advancing Māori interests. The same with rights to cutting rights over forestry. So what I'm trying to say is that I think while we've got these site-by-site fights to retain some of the gains over this time, and they're important in an immediate sense, we need to not be diverted from understanding the bigger picture, because what it's designed to do is to prevent decolonisation and constitutional transformation. And while we're fighting fires and running multiple Waitangi Tribunal claims, they are remaking neoliberalism to reorder the state to prevent even those gains from happening again. So we do need to understand that strategy, and we need to have a game plan. So let me just identify two of the particular things from the areas that I work in that worry me, and they're boring. I'm sorry, they're boring. One of the focuses of ACT is creating a new Ministry of Regulation and a proposed regulatory standards bill. It is meant to sound boring while all these other things are happening, but it's designed to impose a deeply embedded institutional, ideological and legal straitjacket over everything the state does in the future, including even changes at the margins. It's about letting capital rip. It's to bring back the kind of things we had about Māori deaths in the forestry and on farms, the Pike River tragedy, the rip-off landlords, the financial rorts, etc. It requires an absolute priority to be given to private property rights to ensure mining, water extraction, climate measures, etc. are unimpeded. So we just had a couple of days ago the Minister for Mining Companies, Shane Jones, asking for advice on how to ensure that those mining companies can be compensated if a future government restores mining bans as a deterrent to them doing so. Now, that actually exists in many free trade agreements. It's known as investor-state dispute settlement, where investors who knew about the risks when they made the investment, may have only made a minimal investment, can go to these offshore kangaroo courts and get awarded hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in lost future profits when communities like Māori have done in the past with Pākehā allies force governments to close down those mining operations. And ironically, New Zealand first opposed this investor-state disputes process. And currently we have a policy of no investor-state dispute settlement in new FTAs. Now Shane Jones is going to be their champion for an ACT policy. So we're about to launch a kind of campaign to prevent them doing that. So let me wind up. These are all matters on which Māori and Tauiwi have common cause. They are where Te Tiriti o Waitangi becomes the bedrock safeguard and the alternative value base for resistance, where whanaungatanga, kaitiakitanga, manaakitanga, ahitanga, and rangatiratanga provide the value base to work from. But to get there, we need to have analysis and strategy and the ability to operationalize those. This conference can help that, and we need to make sure that the focus remains on Te Tiriti o Waitangi itself without defending the crown-crafted principles of Te Tiriti. So in understanding the end game that's being played out, I want to suggest that we look at some things that worked quite well in the 1980s. Some of you will be familiar with Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. There were social analysis or structural analysis workshops that were run largely with Māori activists, some of whom are now elderly kaumatua, but also with Pākehā to understand the connections between capitalism, ideology, and the struggles on the ground. There were alternative visions that were developed from there. There were mobilizations that were amongst groups, including those that we don't see much of now, such as the churches, but who worked with each other and then formed alliances beyond that. Some of us operated in trying to connect the understanding of policy and what was happening in the governmental, the kāwanatanga space, with what was happening on the ground. Kia Mōhio Kia Mārama Trust was one of those that developed a whole range of kind of cartoon resources, with Moana Maniapoto doing those, and breakdown of policy stuff, which I did along with Barbara Menzies and some others. It was a relationship between Pākehā and Māori working on a similar kaupapa, supported by the Māori Council of Churches. So these are just some things that worked in the past that some of us are keen to work out how we revive now. And I've talked for long enough, and I'm going to pass across to Anab. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you, Jane. A rousing start. Thank you so much. And for the sake of brevity, over to you, Annette. Thank you.
Kia ora no tātou I hui mai nei I tēnei pō. Ki te whakarongo me pēhea te huarahi tōtika, mō ngai tātou e kia nei ngā hapu o ngā rangatira o Aotearoa nei. Me ngā manuhiri e noho ana kei raro I te maru o tō tātou nei tiriti, me tana kāwanata tuatahi ko te whakaputanga tērā. He tino ua te whakaaro me pēhea te pakanga inai nei, nā te mea, kei te noho kāpō te nuinga I raro I te whakaaro, kei te kino te whakahaere o te kāwanatanga. Kāre he tika o rātou nei whakatau e pāna ki tō tātou nei tiriti, engari kei te haere tonu te huna o rātou nei kōrero, kei raro e kia nei I te ārai o te kāwanatanga. Ko tāku nei inoi kia tātou I te pōnei, me waiho atu tau atu āhuatanga ki te taha. Kia u tonu ki tō tātou nei whakapapa ki te whenua. Kia u tonu hoki ki tō tātou nei Māori motuhake. I rongi te whakaaro kei a mātou anō te iwi Māori, te whakaaro rangatira me pēhea te huarahi tōtika mo tō tātou nei whaia a Papa Tuanuku. Ko tāku nei mihi ki ngā kaipakahaere o tēnei o ngā whakaaro, kei te mihi atu kia koutou. Ko tai ki te wā pea, he pakangana anō te iwi Māori ki te kāwanatanga, I rongi te whakaaro o rātou nei mahi whakaparahako, he mahi kino, he mahi e kia nei mahi tinihanga kia tātou. Kei te tino, kei te rongo au I ngā kōrero a Jane, kei te moho wetahi o ngā Pākehā I tautoko I tēnei o ngā wero kia tātou te iwi Māori. Engari kei te noho moke te nuinga o ngai tātou ki o tātou nei kāinga ki taha, ki te whakaro me pēhe o tātou nei whakaro. Ko tāku nei I noi koutou, kia koutou, kaua pāpauri mai, kia kaha, kia maumahara kei a tātou noa kia nei nā whānau, nā whakatipuranga o tēnei o ngā tuāhuatanga. Pēnei I ngā kōrero o Eva Ricardma, o Te Puiama, o Tāpirana Ngata Hoki mā, kia noho ki te pūmau I o tātou nei wairua hei whakaro hia mo te whenua me ngā manuhiri ki tā tātou nei taha. Ka uri au ki tērā o ngā reo ki whakamārama mai o koenei whakaro, engari kei te mihi atu kia koe Jane. I'm really want to focus on the holding the line part of our kōrero. Jane has given, I think, an important introduction to the way that neoliberalism has shaped the last 50 years and Māori response to the attacks on our tino rangatiratanga and our Māori, mana Māori motuhake. But I think this year, while Jane says that we may be faced with the difficulty of trying to deal with the fragments of these new bills. I mean, there's been 13 bills in this 100 days, 9 of which have been pure attacks on Māori. The reality for Māori is we can't ignore them in a wider strategy of resistance to hold the line against neoliberalism. For to do so would actually, I think, suggest to those in power that we are not aware that what their attack is really about is a subsumation of our values and principles that guide our status as tangata whenua in this whenua, but also our whakapapa relationships to Te Taiao and Papa Tuanuku herself, which guides those relationships. And so, Jane, unfortunately for the Māori world, I think there has to be a determination in holding the line to actually deal with those fragmented strategies that are being used almost like Trojan horses to guide us away from that underpinning. But we need to be more savvy in how we use our resources and our energy to highlight how those strategies are actually part of a whole of a design introduced by this new right regime to undermine our rangatiratanga, to actually steal the balance of our resources that are available for the agenda of privatisation, which underpins many of their thinking. If we look at the attacks in the first 100 days, the attacks have been on dismantling Te Mana o Te Wai strategies for infrastructural protection of our rights and interests, obligations and responsibilities to Wai, to our water. The second attack has been at looking at strategies to actually make more uneven the access to justice and the access to health services, which are causing a range of a dilemma for Māori communities with the disproportionate impact that those strategies have in the past, and now that they've been dismantled will continue to have for Māori communities. So when we talk about dismantling the Māori Health Authority, we're not really talking about that. We're talking about return to a system that has failed us for 50 years in providing strategies that are actually about the death of Māori and really the heart of colonialism, which is about the denial of our right to be, to exist, to operate in our own worldview, in our own paradigms of development, in our own institutions or social institutions of whānau Haponiwi that actually connect us to this place. When we look at the undervaluing of Te Reo Māori, what we're really looking at is an effort to actually deny us the language or the vernacular of how our laws are transmitted through successive generations. And we need to be really clear that in the past 40 years, there have been huge gains made through that vernacular, the reclamation of Te Reo Māori and the tikanga that it carries as tools of emancipation of Māori communities who for too long were actually, I think, because of the Hun report, because of a whole range of strategies in the 60s and 70s falling into the trap of succumbing to the assimilative view that becoming part of the white culture and that white space was actually going to provide us our salvation. I think that the other attack that's really been prevalent for me is that in the reconstruction of our values that's happened in that 40 years, we have actually come up with universal guidance of how we might transform not just the Māori systems or reclaim the Māori systems, but transform economics and the paradigms of benefit distribution, which are based on quite different values of individualism, but collective obligation, responsibility, first to our mother, the planet, but then to each other to ensure that we have a quality of life together in a coexistence design that Te Tiriti promised. And I think the fifth one is that we have to ask ourselves, why ACT is so determined to have an agenda that is about keeping uppermost in at least I think the white part of our society, that they are attacking Te Tiriti, they are attacking treaty principles by providing their own treaty principles, which have nothing to do with Māori, which are built on a matrix of individualization, which is decontextualized linguistically, culturally, and economically from the basis from which the original constitutional founding documents were based. So when I came to the session, I said to myself, Janie's going to do as she's done, that we should not be diverted to the scattergun approach that we've been confronted. But I'm saying to us as Māori, we should be educated about it, and then we should formulate strategies in the ways we can to actually provide energy to maintaining, holding the gains we've made, but also transforming those gains into viable alternatives, I think, as blueprint options for many of those that live with us in our society that don't share the values completely, but actually, I think, are respectful of the values that are guiding us. One of the key things is we need to recast what the Te Tiriti principles debate will mean to our constitutional transformation dynamic of the last 40 years and the efforts of the late Dr. Moana Jackson and others to actually put Mātikere Mai in the consciousness of whānau hapu and iwi as a guide for the reconstruction of a constitutional relationship that is both transformative but is embedded in Māori philosophy. And that we need to be really clear that to recast that, we need to challenge in every forum what is being promoted by ACT, I think complicitly and obviously supported by the National Party. And I'm not too sure where the New Zealand First position is on this. I can't help but there's some selfish desire for them to get particular advantage for Māori elite in the privatisation options that may emerge. So I'm not there. My opinion for what they're about in this three-headed monster that we are confronted with still remains, as I said at Waitangi, a subject yet to be determined. Because if they are, as the ACT Party and the National Party, purely determined to substitute collectivism and the ideals of whānau and hapu with the individual and individualization and disenfranchisement of us from our resources, then it seems a contradiction completely to many of the efforts that Winston and Shane themselves have made in trying to develop a capitalist Māori economy. So I just raise that as a debate point. I think we need not underestimate also what the Treaty of Waitangi Principles Bill is about. It's something that the National Party is saying it will go no further, but frankly, they have already started implementing it by stealth. If we look at the way they have dismantled the Māori Health Authority, that they have denied the Māori, Te Tiriti o Waitangi itself and its guarantees, in the high order outcomes that will still remain as a result of the that disestablishment. And because I think that they may, if the public opinions are swaying as the media seems to suggest they are, followers, they may consider entrenching matters at the select committee of that first phase, which of itself would create a constitutional crisis for us as Māori. And we need to, I think we need to be really clear about what that would mean. For my people of Ngāti Pikiao, we have said if that was to happen, we would then take steps to immediately disenfranchise ourselves from the rope or the rope around our necks of the kāwanatanga institutions. They have been really clear that the debate of what we do in the wake of that challenge to our very existence is required as a starting point, looking and examining the options of secession from the kāwanatanga and the re-establishment of rangatiratanga in more fundamental ways than just participation as advisory groups or in partnership arrangements that are still within a framework of someone else. The potential consequences of that bill are hugely important and must be seen as a springboard of platform to the changes that I'm hoping we will debate tonight. Jane is right, they fall into those 4 or 5 categories of liberation that we've all, I think, wanted and tried to see as part of educating our communities ourselves for the fact that there are alternatives to what's been proffered, that we can test those alternatives and that we can actually implement those alternatives. And as Ani Makaire said on Saturday, we have many examples now of those alternatives bearing fruit, with the challenge of Whata Winiata and Mason Jury to establish Te Ware Wānanga o Raukawa, those institutions thriving and developing alternative models of development, but of course their funding being over time diminished in favour of the myth that we are providing te reo as an open access to other members of the community by funding arrangements, which are still negligible, being refocused to enable Pākehā to engage with understanding Māori and Mātauranga Māori and tikanga Māori, while the authentic institutions of transformation themselves are being denied that opportunity. So education is one. Action. One of the things that I have really been heartened about this week is when you watch 16-year-olds organising what only could have been a significant mind shift from the shackles of the system to the reinstitution of our tikanga, our law, as a complete challenge to David Seymour's arrival at their school, to the fact of his policies of stopping Feed the Kids, of the institution of frameworks that would deny resources to teachers to promote te reo Māori me ona tikanga, and the challenge coming from young, articulate 16-year-olds who are really clear that the alternative that they were brought up and raised in Kohanga Reo is much more the kind of life and way of life they want to promote than what is now on offer by a kāwanatanga that is both selfish, mean-spirited, and in denial of their fundamental status in this land. I think that organisation by those young people is the kinds of things that we need to be mirroring at home in our hapu. And I know as one of our hapu strategies, we're reinstituting decolonisation strategies. We're reinstituting some of the workshops that we used to do about direct action and how we would actually promote direct action in our own communities, but also provide safety nets for those that may fall foul of the Pākehā law. One of those direct action strategies, which we're asking the brown capitalists or the Māori capitalists to look at, is the non-payment of rates and civil disobedience in that regard, to ensure that we create some real clear understanding that the use of our lands for the advancement of political agendas and infrastructural developments that actually destroy our mother, our lakes, are actually things we will not tolerate. So we won't allow local governments or regional governments to be exploitative of our kindness, because of course we've shared water to date with people. Another one in the organisation is actually working to have summits. That's what Māori are doing. We're going to have these national summits. I think we're learning as we go along with Tūranga Waiwai Rātana, Waitangi, and of course there's one in Kahungunu. But we need to be more savvy how we develop strategies and actions from those summits in the particular areas in the health where our own well-being is actually under threat and under attack. It would be antithetical to the spirit of Te Tiriti o Waitangi if we actually just charge on with actually taking the moment to reflect on our own responsibilities and duties and obligations to care for our own people, many of whom are suffering right now because of the mean-spirited substitution of values that's taken place. And then I think we need to also organise more than have talk fests about constitutional change dynamic. The kind of conventions that were contemplated in 1984 at post the devolution agenda at the Hui Taumata in 1985, after the Hikoi te Waitangi and the reconstruction of Hui at Tūranga Waiwai, in 1992 with the establishment of the Hirangi Hui. We need to have those constitutional conventions rebrought back with actually strategies, I think, for severe reconstitution of our relationships between and amongst ourselves as Māori, and then between and amongst ourselves as communities. And finally, I think the last thing is that the next 3 years, we cannot be silent. We must speak wherever we are against the injustice of neoliberalism that is actually invading the hearts and minds of our communities and striking fear in the hearts and minds of those that will believe that those three-headed monsters actually have the wherewithal, but also the intellectual grunt to justify what they're doing to us. And we need courage. We need to actually you know, I rang around this morning when that young 16-year-old was suspended from Freiburg. We need to actually start to actually enhance the collectivizing of our resources so that we work together to actually assist that young boy against the racism and other institutional issues that his particular action has confronted. And I think this is just going to be an example of all the way through. And my last thing, and it's a plea to many of us that are the ageing activists, the Māori population is vibrant. It is very much concentrated in terms of action terms in the 15 to 30-year-olds. We have to give power to that leadership, and we need to support that leadership. And in the health arena, it's particularly vital that we recognise that there are many, many, many of our younger people, whether it's in nurses or as doctors, or whether they are working as administrators of health within marae, iwi and iwi-based health providers. We need to actually give them support and not keep telling them what to do. And I don't say this with any disrespect, but I see too many dames and sirs on the TVs on this topic and not enough. And this is my talk to Māori media on this. Not enough concentration of understanding to those that are actually on the front line, holding the line, steeped in the understandings that neoliberalism is that actually it's completely juxtaposed to our understanding of whanaungatanga, of manaakitanga and of kaitiakitanga, and can articulate that in ways that actually can cross the bridge so that we can have many supporters for a unified I think, protest against what's happening to us all. You know, we share Aotearoa, and we all need he whakaputunga and te tiriti, but more fundamentally, we also need to recognise that the power that needs to be transferred to Māori again should be given willingly and not, there's a word called matapiko in Māori, not given in a way that is dispirited, that shows reluctance. And those are my thoughts for tonight. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Annette. A very provocative presentation. And I think those points there you say about, and has come up in the chat as well, that we need to support those who stand out and make sure that they're kept safe so that they can do their work. Look, I've had a message come through, a request for this session to go an extra 15 minutes. Jane and Annette, I don't know if you spotted that in the chat, but would you be prepared to do that?
Yes.
Lovely. Lovely. Okay, so we've got till 7:15. We've had a couple of questions come in. The first one's from Debbie Fish, who asks about working in economics and finance in the public sector. How can those who work in that area translate these underlying narratives into small, actionable shifts in a way that is palatable for other public servants sympathetic to the kaupapa and those who want to keep their ministers happy? In brackets. Either of you like to comment on that? How can people who are working right at the core of the monster actually action some of this stuff?
Jane, I'll have a go and you go after me. In the banking sector, you know, stop taking mortgages against Māori land. Just real simple things. Stop requiring us to provide security as individuals, which would sever obligations to future generations. Start developing papers that actually look at the heart of capital and different processes of redistribution of wealth. And that's the last thing is tax the rich. I mean, you know, I don't know where these people are working, which finances, if it's with the government or if it's with the bank, but you know, it's absolutely, well, I think it's unconscionable, the kind of income over the last few years that banks have been earning while we've been sitting in COVID and homelessness and without work and the insecurity of longevity of our own health needs, and while those matters have been allowed to continue.
Let me talk a little bit about working in government, because I don't know that there's actually an answer that fits the range of conditions that you've put there, in particular keeping ministers happy. Again, I'm thinking back, but also thinking now. Back in the 80s, when the neoliberal stuff was happening there was something, and it may remember it or she may be too young, there was something called the Kumara Vine, that there were some public servants in Wellington who kind of anonymously put together a regular, this is what's actually really going on inside, which was subversive, but it wasn't sufficiently subversive that it will get them sacked. I think there's less tolerance now than there was then, but you know, there is no way comfortably to talk truth to power when you're in the institutions of power and not take risks. Being part of a collective becomes important. Not being isolated, finding ways, even forming entities of public servants who put themselves under a title of public servants for tino rangatiratanga or ethical public servants or something. So, you know, I'm not sure that, yes, you need to do what Annette was talking about before, of making sure that when there are policy proposals and so on come up, that you argue back against them. But I think there's also, if we're risk-free in a personal sense, we're not going to be acting on the basis of this kaupapa. So I'm sorry, Debbie, I don't know that if you want to retire as a lifelong public servant, there's an easy answer to that one. Says me, who's just retired as a 42 years as an academic, and it's no easier now for academics to do that either. And I suppose the last thing I'd say then is that some people who are more safe in those institutions need to show leadership. Those in academic institutions who are professors need to show that leadership. Those who are in senior positions in the public service need to show that leadership and provide cover for those who are below and more vulnerable. And that's both for Māori and for tauiwi in the public service.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see play out, how the government pushes back. Another question here is really asking, how do we achieve a non-violent revolution? So much of our imagination when we consider progressive movements is limited to liberal campaigns or policy changes. How do we reach constitutional transformation and long-lasting anti-neoliberal change in a non-violent way? How are you feeling about violence this evening?
I suppose it depends on how you define violence. I mean, what the state does every day is violence. Well, and this might cross over with some of the other questions as well, but and it goes back to the activism issues that Annette was raising as well. I mean, one of the things that is incredibly effective is hijacking institutions of the state. Like when people are arrested for protest activities, or when people are hauled into forums that those in power think they control, fighting back in those spaces becomes critical. And we had, you know, in a lot of the protests, in fact, virtually all of the protests that I remember, the court became a site of political contest. And people didn't expect to get off. They didn't expect to have lawyers who would come in and fight in the Pākehā system to, you know, oh yes, I did it, but I don't want any consequences. And we made the courts into a political forum. And we've been talking with some of the younger lawyers over the last couple of months about doing some of the self-defense training that we developed during those days and some of the resources so that people know what to do when they're getting into those spaces. One, to be reasonably safe. Don't put yourself into vulnerable positions unless you've thought it through. But then providing support so that those who do can fight the Crown in its own places. So that was a long blurb. Sorry, Annette, to you.
I think it's already happening. Toitū movement is very much like, for me, WAC was, Waitangi Action Committee, in the 80s. So they are a non-violent movement, but they have huge ability to mobilise. And they are mobilising on significant issues at different places right throughout the motu, which are stretching some of the state's resources to respond to those efforts. My criticism, like I'm criticised ourselves in the 1980s, there's a lot of bluster, but we haven't got our education material ready. That they tend to use TikTok and social media about mobilisation strategies, but the hard yards needs to be followed up with decolonisation wānanga that gives some confirmed strategies. So they're more than just defence ones, self-defence ones. They're about, you know, there is a different option to a capitalist option when we're investing, you know. There is a different way of looking at an ETS system that's not going to be based on a derivative of capitalism, you know. So those options need to be presented and debated. And that I agree with Jane in her earlier comments that we need to revamp a really torrid intelligentsia on the left. And that material needs to be disseminated in ways that our whānau, our communities can understand. Because quite often, you know, there's 600 Māori PhDs at the moment or something, you know, and in certain areas. And I'm wondering where
I think we have a glitch. We'll just wait a moment. Okay, let's move to another question. Maybe, Jane, you can respond to this. A question from Danny Pickering, making the point that once again, we're seeing Māori being the ones who step up and go into the fight, and that they're not hearing their Pākehā colleagues talking about direct action and taking, you know, developing strategies. So the question is, what are some ways that Tangata Tiriti can help to share the load and take on some of that risk?
One of the things that comes with the privilege of being Tangata Tiriti is that we occupy some spaces that Māori don't. And I said before that transformation doesn't come without risk. And that involves taking risk in those spaces. There was a question there as well about unions. You know, we all have sites in which we have some power to exercise that power. And if we play it by the rules in those spaces, then there won't be transformation. And some of the risks that are taken will be bigger than some of the other risks. And that's where I think, again, leadership becomes important. At the same time, recognizing what Annette was saying, that, you know, us old crusties need to get out of the way. We can provide support, we can provide resources, we can provide analysis, but we need to facilitate that space for the younger ones to come through. Now, I know, speaking about universities, for example, how much more vulnerable the young academics are than when we were back in the Springbok Tour days and the Waitangi Action days and so on. But if there are collectives who stand together, it makes it much more difficult to be picked off. And we need to take the rhetoric, such as academic freedom, critic and conscience and all of that stuff, and make it meaningful. And if that means then having fights around that, then we do that. If it's for unions, doing what unions have done in the past of having bans, for example, on mining sites or on other sites that are destructive, then the unions need to take that action. And we don't necessarily see that these days. The churches, who used to be incredibly strong, both the Pākehā churches and the Māori Council of Churches was in the lead in a lot of that liberation theology work. And they developed things like in the Anglican Church, this bicultural governance model, which now seems to have evaporated. So those who are in that space have opportunities to work and call for social justice based on whatever the theological principles are, in alliance with Te Ao Māori. So there's lots of spaces. We've just got to be creative and we've got to be risk takers. And it's back.
Yeah, welcome
Sorry, I
back.
keep moving out. But I mean, can I just say, Jane, I agree with that. More forums like this, you know. We used to have a lot of these back in the day. I'm just thinking, for the Covenant for the Elimination of the Discrimination Against Women, I think I went to about 5 huis a week for a long time, you know. All of that stuff, we need to have that stuff going on again as well. I think we've got into this social media thing. So I'm into bringing the cup of tea back too, for a lot more face face-to-face engagement, because they can actually, Big Brother follows us too much on that social media thing too as well. So that's just some of those comments.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If we're going to have strategies, if we're going to fight back, we need to be sure that we're doing it under a blanket of secrecy. Look, there was a
Not sure about that. I think we need to be careful, and I don't do social media for that reason. But at the same time, we need to not get paralyzed. So, you know, we need means of dissemination, and we need to ensure that, for example, Māori media not only do their job, but those great ones on Māori media like Moana Maniapoto and those who are trying to take those positions have support, because they may end up being the only current affairs programs that there actually are. And you know, Māori TV is going to come under pressure. I think we need to be savvy about the pathways that we use for communications, but we need to not get paralyzed at the same time.
Absolutely. Look, there was an earlier question. How do we honour Article 2 in short to medium term? Other than the civil disobedience actions, etc., what does the path look like for Hapu? Do we start at iwi level because there is a resource scale there?
So for me, it's really simple. Article 2 guaranteed us our relationships, some of which are akin to ownership, some aren't. Some are akin to more whanaungatanga style relationships to our resources to be maintained. And so we need to educate ourselves about that. We need to reclaim those resources, but we also need to make sure we don't mirror the exploitative models of capitalism, which many of us have only known for the utilisation or exploitation of those resources. I've been saying to the Māori capitalists, they've got to start funding the transformation. I'm public on this. You know, I'm on some of those boards that make a lot of money, and I'm saying we should be funding our rangatahi groups to do the decolonisation, you know, so those are practical strategies. Iwi, I have problems with, because iwi are part of what Jane talked about earlier. They're treaty settlement constructs to meet treaty settlement outcomes, but not necessarily connected to the relational polities that actually maintain the relationships between ourselves. So I still stick to hapu, coalitions of hapu, but also coalitions of community. You know, we've got really good action groups against pollution and environmental exploitation around our lakes that are made up of all the people that live around our lakes, not just the tangata whenua that possess the primary obligation to protect. So, you know, we got to stop being reluctant to draw people in to help share the load of the strategy. And Jane was saying Pākehās need to step up, but we need to try and find a fora where we can sit down and share as well, Jane. But don't expect me to come and educate you in those fora. I just want to know what we're going to do to take back different models of development that aren't based on capitalism.
Okay. Look, there's a final question here. Could these issues be challenged in the world courts or Strasbourg International Criminal Court? The three-headed taniwha breaches international law, which includes contra preferentum. Could the British monarchy, as the actual signatory of Te Tiriti or Waitangi, be charged with breach of contract?
So I'm just going to give the United Nations Special Rapporteur is having a visit to New Zealand in an informal way. So raise that in your submission to him, and when he's here from the 2nd of April, you know, that's just one way of leverage. I prefer local solutions before we go to global solutions, but free trade agreements are going to interfere with our local solutions. So that's why the education needs to carry on. I don't know if I want to spend a lot of energies going to this World Court of Justice, but people want to. That's their energy, not mine.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with with Annette, and I mean, she referred to the free trade agreements, and of course many of the people on this call will have been activists around the TPPA, and out of that came in a very long Waitangi tribunal process that took up many years of Annette and my lives, came an entity called Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, which is committed to he whakaputanga me te tiriti in the trade agreement space. And it is a long and frustrating battle, but it's one of those of continuing to talk truth to the power of the Crown in negotiating these things. One of them was the free trade agreement with the UK. And the issue there was the UK was the original party to Te Tiriti. And the UK said, nah, that's in the past. That's history. Nothing to do with you now. You raised this with the New Zealand government. And that was an important battle. It was a battle of principle, but because it took place within the boundaries that the Crown controlled, there was no way of shifting the outcome. That doesn't mean that you give up. It means that you work out how to mobilize around the kinds of issues that came through in that agreement. And that's part of what you do on the ground here. If we look at what's happened with Palestine and the genocide there in the international arena, we see that whatever outcomes you might get there, a state that is going to exercise abusive forms of power is not going to subordinate itself to whatever findings there are in those international arenas. So they become fights that we have to fight here, and we have to develop alliances within Aotearoa, and then we have to develop alliances beyond that.
Okay, thank you. We have to wrap it up now. It's been a fantastic evening. As you can see in front of you is a slide. These are all the partners to this conference, many of whom have supported it before and have enabled us to pull together an amazing program that you've been able to enjoy so far and will continue. Just to let you know, there is the Marathon for Racial Justice on Friday the 22nd of March. And most of these recordings also will be going up onto YouTube. And I'd also like to just thank the volunteers who have helped bring this event to life, apart from the partnerships, but those who have been working in the back rooms as moderators, the tech people. Very much a special thanks to those, both Annette and Jane, who have come here and spoken this evening, and to all of those who have attended and have been making many, many comments in the chat. There's been a lot of information in the chat, so do have a look at that. If there's any questions outstanding that haven't been answered, we'll ask Annette and Jane to have a look at those and we can get back to you, apart from those who have posted anonymously. So I would just like to acknowledge what we have done this evening. The kaupapa is so important. There is much work to be done. Coming together and having these conversations can only enhance and inspire us all. And that is exactly what we need, because there is a hell of a fight ahead of us and we need to get in amongst it, support those, step forward. If we believe in this, we need to put our hands up and show our heads above the parapet. No point sitting behind saying, yeah, that's a great idea. We believe this in our hearts. We must stand up for this. This is only right. It is only just. So thank you again. I think I've said all the things I need to say. And thank you for running on over time, Jane and Annette. Much appreciated, given you both had a hell of a day from the sound of it and more to come. So much appreciated that you would share with us this evening. I think everybody's had a blast and a shake up. So kia ora koutou, everybody. We'll see you at the next time.